online. Thank you. So over to our chair. Thank you so much.
Welcome everyone, both online and here in the room, to our session on green grids, cross-border trade in renewables and the energy transition. It's an enormous pleasure to host this event alongside COP26 here from Glasgow. This event is hosted by the Energy and Economic Growth Applied Research Programme, an innovative 5-year programme run by Oxford Policy Management and funded by the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Our aim is to promote evidence-based programming and policy making, bringing the benefits of modern energy to all and strengthening sustainability of this energy transition. My name is Ben Kloos. I'm a senior consultant at Oxford Policy Management, and I'm joined by a distinguished panel both here in the room and online, covering a huge area of sectors. Let me just give a very brief introduction of my panel. We have Mr. Ram Gopal Kabuja, the Joint Secretary in the Ministry of Energy, Water Resources and Irrigation of the Government of Nepal. Unfortunately not with us live because of time zone and travel challenges, but nonetheless with a contribution from Ms. Jyoti Parekh, the Executive Director for Integrated Research and Action for Development, IRADI. She's also a Joint Nobel Prize winner for her work alongside the IPCC. It's a shame she isn't here, but we will have her contribution in the form of a video. We also have Abhishek Shivakumar, an independent consultant and modeler who undertook some joint research with the Energy and Economic Growth Project on a potential Gulf India electricity interconnector. Online, joining us from California at an early hour still, is Mr. Ranjit Deshmukh, Assistant Professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and leader of the EEG research program on multi-criteria analysis for power planning in Southern Africa. Vikas Kruger is a researcher at the University of Cape Town and co-leader of the EEG research on renewable energy auctions in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And last but not least, we have Dr. Sergio Misana, the Executive Director of Climate Parliament, that just yesterday launched their Green Grids initiative, I believe here at COP26. Also on the panel next to me is Simon Trace, the Program Director for the Energy and Economic Growth EEG Research Program. Already in the introductions it was said, but this really is meant to be a live discussion. We want you to ask questions through Slido here in the room and online, and have as much of an open discussion about this topic of green grids. The premise is exciting. The sun shines all the time somewhere. The wind blows somewhere all the time. Hydro resources can help balance the grid, both across countries, within countries. We can have balancing of intermittency at short and longer intervals through this. So the question really is how viable is this? And I'd like to sort of start my first question to Mr. Ram, make sure I get the name correct, Ram Gopal Kabuja. Mr. Kabuja, Nepal has made great progress in electrification, with now 90% of the population having access to electricity. So perhaps can you start off this panel discussion with a brief overview on how important cross-border trade in electricity is in India, is in Nepal in particular with regards to India.
Benjamin, thanks for your questions. As you said, Nepal has done a lot of efforts to develop its hydropower projects. Presently, we have developed about 2,000 megawatt hydropower projects, but we are also planning to have much more hydropower projects. Within coming 5 years, we will have additional 5,000 megawatt hydropower projects which will be connected in the grid, national grid. And we have planned already 100% of grid for even for rural electrifications. But power demand in our context is not much more as we expected for the domestic consumption. And from 2022 means nowadays we are surplus, we have a surplus energy during wet seasons. But we have little bit deficit energy during dry seasons. Dry season means December to April. At the present context, we are very much conscious about the excess energy, how to export it into the neighboring countries. The potential export neighboring countries is India, and we have a different sort of agreement with India. That is government to government agreement, institutionally institutional. Our Nepal Electricity Authority, it has some agreement or sort of agreement with the Power Trade Corporation in India, NBPN of India, and others that state, Bihar state as well as Uttar Pradesh state, they have some sort of agreement. Based on that agreement, we are exporting the excess energy during wet season, and during the dry seasons, what we do, we again import the electricity from India to Nepal. And this is very, very essential for us to mutual benefit for Nepal as well as India, because in India they have much more power demand during the wet season, means that the monsoon flow for the cooling purpose, for their cooling purpose. But in dry seasons, our hydropower production gets reduced, and because of the flow reduction of the flow in the natural rivers, we have a lot of ROR type, runoff river type hydropower projects. That's why we will get a diminished hydropower production during the dry season. At that time, we need more power because of the cold weather. For heating, we need more power. And at that time, we'll take again the power from India. And in that context, we are having a sort of power import and export nowadays. And after 5 years, we have some sort of studies we carried out in our country with the expert from universities, expert from Water Energy Commission secretaries and others. And we found that by 2025, we will be self-sufficient for electrical energy in our country, and even for dry seasons. At that time, it is very critical for us to have export to India, neighboring countries, and we are also exploring to the other neighboring countries that are now presently Bangladesh as well. We have some bilateral talking with them, and we have a sort of memory of understanding MOU with them as well.
Well, thank you so much for that brief overview. You touched on a great number of points which actually link very nicely to the contribution we're now going to have by video from Jyoti Parak, who, as I said earlier, sadly can't be with us directly, but this is a relatively short video of an interview I conducted with her about some of these topics. So if we could play that now. Jyoti, thank you so much for agreeing to do this video recording.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's my misfortune that I can't be there in person.
The overall webinar and live event on this is on the topic of green grids. There's a lot of discussion on this topic. What is your feeling of the prospects for real progress here at COP on a topic like this?
I say greening of the grid should also include hydropower. And second thing I would emphasize is that cross-border power trade is a very important management instrument. Everyone that does not have to be within national boundaries. If the renewable does not know national boundaries, and neither should our grid should know it. Let us presume that so much power can be obtained by other countries, then can we do net zero earlier or not?
How is the trading market in power changing in South Asia?
We began with bilateral and government-to-government based contracts. First with buying from Bhutan in last century, in fact, and in a small way, selling contract government to government again with Nepal. And in 2013, we began with Bangladesh again, selling from India. Now, altogether, by then, 2013, it had reached 1,200 megawatts. But now we reached 3,700, which is 3 times in 8 years. And I think we think it could go up to 45,000.
Are these grids in South Asia robust enough to cope with that increased demand of trading? Or does it require additional infrastructure investment?
Yes, it does. Capacity is quite robust in India. However, the connection of the grids of the other BBIN countries to this large grid can take by strengthening technical infrastructure so that when it lands a lot of power in one place, it's distributed everywhere. And also internal transmission network is also a major challenge and it requires strengthening and upgradation. So right now, for example, Nepal has hardly 1,500 to 2,000 megawatts of hydropower plants, but it has the capacity of 45,000. So it could grow immensely, provided there's a market for it.
Will trade in hydropower from the Himalayas still be an important part of the mix in South Asia, perhaps for balancing purposes, or will other renewables displace it?
Our modeling studies show that flexible hydro is needed even more critical in managing daily peaks as well as non-peaks, as well as with the large storage plants would be required for seasonal variation. There in Nepal, some people were concerned that if India expands fast into solar energy and solar energy is a lot cheaper than hydropower, would it buy from Nepal and the difference is 2 rupees and 5 rupees? But our modeling work shows that all the 4 countries are a very initial stage of development and everybody has to grow 3 times more than what they are now.
So I know Iradi has been doing some work, some research for EEG recently on how the links between the grids in Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal have helped those 4 countries cope with a sharp decline in electricity demand early in the COVID pandemic. And so here we potentially have an example of how already trading in renewables, but electricity more broadly, can balance the grids. Can you tell us something about your findings on this?
You know, the test of this whole thing is how does it survive in crisis? And that's what we were very, very happy about. There was a large reduction in the electricity demand throughout the Bibin sub-region. And during this period, all cross-border links were continued to operate without any interruption. And now the challenge in India is that coal stock has gone down and there's a big coal shortage in India. At that time, people are now feeling that if we had not just one-way trading and selling and buying, but mutual exchange through power, we can had done much more that way. Some of the shortages could have been avoided. So we continue to honor the earlier one, but now we want to go into a more complex world where both sides exchange power, not just selling and buying contracts.
Well, thank you so much, Jyoti. I truly appreciate your time.
Indeed. So just to summarize that video again, I think we heard 4 key messages there. Cross-border trade in electricity, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal has been growing strongly, but there's so much more potential for it. And that is what you identified in the example of Nepal already as well. The other thing is it started with government-to-government contracts. This is a trend we've seen in most of these energy markets. And as this now develops, as these markets integrate, new investment is needed. But so is also strengthening of the regulatory and perhaps the human capacity side of it. Hydropower clearly is a big story here. It has the potential for Nepal and Bhutan to become key exporters in this region. And that could help solar and wind generation balance. The final message, perhaps, from Jyoti here, if I may summarize it like that, is markets work, if allowed to do so. And we've seen during the COVID crisis just how that has been possible already. And I think with that, maybe, if we look towards a more hypothetical example, Abhishek, you've done some thinking, some modeling work on the techno-economic aspects of long-distance power trade. So we've seen some of this ultra-high voltage DC trade emerge as a possibility. Within China, there are fascinating examples of bringing solar and wind power from Tibet over distances approaching 1,000 miles. Likewise, there's I believe, 1.1 million volt cable that can supply Shanghai with power from the deserts and mountains of Xinjiang province, around 2,000 miles away. So turning to India, you looked at how potentially India and the Gulf states could trade power. Could you tell us a little bit more about your work and the advantages, disadvantages of such trade?
Thanks, Ben. I guess taking it in the reverse order, I think the advantages and disadvantages, the idea of cross-border interconnectors, all the way to having a globally interconnected grid, isn't really a new idea. I think it's been there for many decades. I was told it started with Buckminster Fuller, so really mid 20th century is when these ideas were conceptualized. But I think what's changed more recently that's brought the benefits into kind of stronger focus is important developments in HVDC transmission. So the technologies improved, the costs have reduced. And also the declining costs of renewables, particularly wind and solar. So I think that's brought this discussion of cross-border interconnectors back into stronger focus. So what we did, and this was really following on from the one sun, one world, one grid idea. So we had seen that there was this concept of the one sun, one world, one grid with different phases where phase one would connect the GCC with India and potentially further on to Southeast Asia, and phase two would include the African power pools as well, and then finally phase three would be a globally interconnected grid. So we just wanted to take that very first piece and do a very kind of preliminary modeling assessment to see whether it's worth exploring this question further. So we focused on an interconnector between India and 6 GCC countries. We carried out a techno-economic model. It's an open source model in this tool called Osmosis, so available for anyone to use. And we carried out a kind of long-term energy systems modeling analysis. So from 2015, so we calibrated from 2015 onwards all the way to 2050. What we found were quite surprising results, but maybe I won't give the end away and we can discuss that further as we go.
Well, that is quite a teaser. I'm not quite sure I can quite leave it like that. Yeah. Maybe if you give a little snapshot of what you found there before we move on.
Spoiler alert, I guess. So the end of the paper, what we found is that we ran 75 different scenarios across different locations for a solar power plant on the GCC side that would trade electricity through an interconnect all the way to India. And what we were expecting to find was that India would just gobble up all of this extra solar power from this solar farm that's built on the GCC side. But instead, what we found is that since this was a bidirectional link, power was being traded the other way for the initial decades with the excess hydro on the India side. And there was very little, on the peak when India was reaching its peak, those peak hours and the peak seasons, there was some trade in the GCC to India direction, but most of it for the initial decades were in the other direction. And by 2040 onwards is when we saw a much larger amount of trade in the opposite direction. The second surprising result we found was that, so we did a techno-economic analysis and then a financial analysis on that. So we took from an investor's perspective. So the first part is from a kind of central system planner's perspective. The second is, from an investor in that interconnector, would they be able to get their money back? And the profit we assumed in that case is the arbitrage between the price you could buy it at and sell it at through the interconnector. And what we found was that, in fact, from an investor's perspective, with that simple, if that was your way of remuneration, it wasn't sufficient to make a financial case in most of the scenarios we studied. This was an interesting result for us. And usually when there's a surprising kind of counterintuitive result, either there's a mistake in the model, or what we'd like to believe is there's something worth exploring further. So we hope it's the second in our case.
And that is a good way to you, Ranjit, going over to California. You've been doing work on the Southern African power pool. Perhaps you could provide a little brief overview of the renewable trade that exists there, but more importantly, and I think linked to Abhi's point just there, why is it important to take multi-criteria into account when making such planning decisions?
Sure, thanks, Ben. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. As Ben mentioned, my research team here at UC Santa Barbara has been looking at low carbon transitions in the Southern African power pool. So there's like 12 different countries in Southern Africa that are mostly interconnected. A couple of them are not yet. And we have developed these fairly high spatial and temporal resolution electricity systems planning and operations models. And what that means is we can capture the variability in wind and solar resources and future plants, as well as hydropower resources. And it's important to do so we can quantify the advantages of, let's say, more transmission, or how do we access the least cost resources. And what we are seeing in terms of electricity trade in most of our scenarios is almost like 10 to 30 times what the present electricity trade is. But in coming to the question of multi-criteria assessment and how we can capture these multiple criteria in our planning, not only in our study in Southern Africa, but also in other regions, what we are seeing is there's a lot of wind and solar resources. The potential is huge. So that means we can include multiple criteria like social criteria, like where can we get the most jobs, or environmental criteria, where can we site wind and solar in places with the least biodiversity value, or the least or the most human impact, right, on most disturbed lands. Doing so will allow us to develop wind and solar sites more sustainably, but also hydropower sites more sustainably. And that means we could have potentially different transmission plans and different transmission needs across these wider regions, such as the Southern African power pool. And the last thing I want to say is, like, it's not just the environmental and social criteria that we can bring in, but across these larger regions, the impacts of climate change are also expected to be different. So for example, in the Southern Africa region, we are seeing some regions drying more than others. And then even within a particular year, so intra-annual variability, the weather is also going to be different. So then we can balance out the resources, such as hydro. Some rivers might dry out more than others in a particular year. We can share resources by having these interconnected countries, but also increase electricity trade.
That's great. And maybe changing the angle slightly here, Vikas Kruger, you and the team at at Cape Town University have been researching renewable power procurement. So looking at some of these financing aspects here, clearly investment is needed to mobilize. Ranjit mentioned a 20 to 30 times increase in power trade in this southern African power pool region alone, and for India and Nepal related regions, we've seen a huge increase in the potential as well. So what is your take on how countries have managed the risks around procuring power? What are some of the lessons emerging from your research?
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to everyone that's participating in this panel. So our research has really been looking at the the ascendancy of auctions or competitive procurement programs for renewables, particularly in Africa. But we've now expanded that to look at Latin America as well as India to draw lessons for the benefit of the continent. And the reason why we've done this is because we've seen how effective these auctions are at crowding in investment into especially the generation space, in particular solar and wind, and doing that at a cost competitive level. And so what's been key in all of these programs is sorry, when I talk about all of these programs, I'm specifically also referring to the South African program, but also those of our neighboring countries, many of which form part of this power pool in the Southern African regions, such as Zambia and Namibia, is the ability to build and maintain the trust of the market, being the bidders into these programs. And that's done in various ways. But I think what is crucial for achieving any kind of long-term sustainability, and that becomes even more important when we think about issues such as benefit sharing in the region or localization of manufacturing, is to have long-term planning informing these kind of procurement programs. And that's why Ranjit's research, for example, is so important, because it informs what these auction programs actually end up procuring. And there should be a very clear and almost automatic link between these planning models and then procurement on a timely basis. And so that's been a key component of our findings.
Great, and we can come back to some of the issues around this, but I'd love to return to some of the policy sides of it. And Sergio Misano, you're the Executive Director of Climate Parliament. Perhaps, first of all, if you could introduce Climate Parliament, not all of us might be as familiar with it, and also say a little bit about the work you've been doing on green grids.
Sure, thank you, Ben. The Climate Parliament is an international network of members of Congress and Parliament. We are incorporated in Belgium and in the UK, and what we do is organize parliamentarians in different countries in national networks, and basically our work consists on building capacity among parliamentarians about climate and energy issues, and motivating the parliamentarians to take action on these issues. Specifically on grids. Well, I wanted to also mention that we have collaborated on such a thing with the Energy and Economic Growth Program, precisely organizing engagement between experts, some of them in this distinguished panel, and members of parliament from Africa and South Asia. But specifically, recently we have been organizing what is called the Green Grids Initiative, which was announced yesterday at the World Leaders Summit by Prime Minister Modi. Actually, the partnership between this Green Grids Initiative and the One Sun, One World, One Grid project by India. Basically, the basis of this is based on grids, but our core idea is based on the fact that we are really, and this is perhaps a truism to mention in the context of the COP, but we are really running out of time. We are talking about having an 83%, the IPCC was talking about having an 83% chance of staying within 1.5 degrees, and at current level of emissions that would be gone in 4 years. And perhaps emphasizing also something very simple, and it's the fact that we are at 1.1 degrees and we are experiencing already catastrophic climate change in many parts of the world, including developed countries. And 1.5 degrees is not good by any stretch of the imagination. So speed and scale are essential, and we are at the same time putting forth the very simple idea that there are enough renewable energy resources to power the world economy many times over, as long as we have the grid infrastructure to do so. But we're thinking in terms of a war economy. I mean, this is so urgent. Thinking of the way, for instance, the United States transformed its economy after Pearl Harbor in just a few months, if not weeks, from basically all of Detroit stopped producing cars and started. War is not a great metaphor because it involves violence, but a sense of urgency that is still not perhaps in the political world and that we are trying to instill. But at the same time, the grid infrastructure is necessary for us to advance at the speed and scale that the crisis requires, not necessarily realistic in terms of the political processes. Yeah. So that's where we are, that's what we're doing. We launched this initiative by Prime Minister Modi, and I'd be happy to explain more about it later on in the conversation.
And I would love to hear a bit more about it. But we've also received quite a few questions already on Slido. And Simon, maybe you could summarize a few.
Pick out three.
Right.
One for Joint Secretary Karbuja, one for Abhishek, and one for Ranjit, maybe. So maybe starting with you, Joint Secretary. So two questions here, really. I mean, one is just a sort of general question about how Nepal and India price their exports to each other, whether it's same price in both directions or it's cost plus or whatever. But also, who's the net exporter at the moment over a year? And I guess maybe adding to that, just for interest, where does Nepal want to be ultimately in terms of being a net importer or a net exporter?
Regarding the cost, we have different types of, different sort of agreement. We have energy banking concept. Some up to 2,200 megawatt. We have power export to the country, India, when we got a lot of excess energy. And they will again, the same energy, amount of energy will give to us during the dry season. Just energy banking concept, just in terms of the unit of energy. And another agreement, another sort of agreement was like some G2G agreement, like G2G agreement. We have up to 200 megawatt again for, they have set up some price, that subsidized price, about 5.6 Nepalese rupees per kilowatt hour at the point of border that we'll meter. Next, that another commercial agreement with the power producer of the India. We will have some agreement with the power producers. They will have commercial agreement, means what is the cost of their production, and there will be some benefit for 10% will be added, and they will supply to that. But the commercial agreement is as per need. When is it required, we will take the energy, and if it is not, then we stop it, like that. Such type of agreement we have. Okay.
And at the moment, Nepal is a net exporter or a net importer?
And at this moment, up to now, 2021, we are net import still. But in 2022, we have it will be now the net export, but little amount of energy, not too much. But after 2025, we will have much more export. about 1,000 gigawatt hour electricity will be imported by
very much.
2025.
Leave the next question was
For Abhishek, I mean, this is more about embedded carbon. So the question is, did you compare the embedded carbon in the transmission versus the embedded carbon that would have been used building out capacity nationally when you were doing your analysis?
Right. So yes, it could be, I guess, two meanings of embedded carbon here. Maybe one is in the transmission infrastructure itself, like kind of the steel and all of that. But the other would be the kind of grid emissions intensity. And the emissions intensity we did look into. So what we implemented in the model were so India's NDC targets. And at the time, there was no net zero target. So we had India's NDC, which could be argued is not as ambitious as India has the capacity to achieve. And two of the GCC's NDC targets. So those were the only targets we had. And the truth is the interconnector comes in all scenarios, but doesn't make too much of a dent in the emissions on the India side. That is much more affected by what India builds out in its own generation system. But that being said, I think one area for further exploration is the fact that India, I mean, in this study, we just looked at the GCC in India, but in the future, it could be a conduit with the rest of Southeast Asia, where there are much lower renewable potentials, for instance, a lot less solar and a bit less wind as well. So in that sense, because we have a shared carbon budget, it could kind of unlock emission reductions in Southeast Asia. So I think that would be worth exploring. But yeah, we haven't done that. I should also mention a couple of other things. One is that we did look at putting in a carbon price at one point. We did scenarios with a carbon price, and this was in an earlier iteration, and we're quickly told that this is just not palatable on the India side, that this will not be,
right.
Yeah.
Well, let's revisit some of those things later, but I think there was
Well,
another...
the third question is a very similar question in a sense, or at least Abhishek started to answer the third question that was put to Ranjit, but we can put it anyway. I mean, in the context maybe of the Southern Africa power pool, Ranjit, do you think that interconnectors will play a sort of significant role in achieving net zero in the future, or are they just a sort of bit low?
I think they would, and that's mainly because countries can now access cheaper renewable resources across the region. Especially like for South Africa. South Africa has great resources as well, and that's like the biggest country with the highest energy and emissions footprint. But they can access better resources from outside their country, and also balancing resources, which can enable sort of integrating that renewable energy. So definitely interconnectors help in meeting that net zero target.
Well, thanks very much. And I think, Vikas, maybe a question to you that builds a little bit on some of this. It is really around how do you then mobilize this investment? Is it what do you think is needed, given your experience and research on this? How can you promote, encourage that investment in cross-border trade in renewables?
Thank you, Ben. There's a great deal of trade already happening within some of the Southern African power pool in this space, and I think most of it is currently by necessity rather than design. So most countries in the power pool are very dependent, for example, on excess capacity in South Africa. But what we are seeing is as energy security issues become much more pertinent in the region. Countries like Namibia, Zambia, also now Mozambique, and Botswana are scrambling to build out their own capacity. The issue is, and I think as Ranjit was saying, that we need an optimization of this system across the region. And currently, the risks that investors are facing are country level risks and project level risks. And that's already a very complex situation. But the biggest risk that they are facing is the risk of bankrupt utilities that are having to buy their power. And so most of the utilities in our region, with the notable exception of NamPower in Namibia, are not able to charge cost-reflective tariffs. And so they can't actually sign bankable power purchase agreements. And for that reason, they often require sovereign guarantees to stand behind these power purchase agreements. Now, the hope and the idea, I think, in the region where we see much more trade between countries is that developers and owners of power projects, especially private power projects, will be able to actually sell power onto, for example, the Southern African Power Pool, or to other large industrial commercial users in neighboring countries, that would offset that risk, right? If Eskom, for example, does not pay, a developer can start selling that power to NamPower or to a large mine in Botswana, and all of a sudden, this pressure that is currently on many of the sovereigns' balance sheets, that is stifling investment in the region, would be alleviated. And so that kind of trade is a real game changer potentially for increasing investment in the region.
So, Joint Secretary, if we looked at Nepal, to what extent is investment a challenge here? Vikas mentioned power purchase agreements and the need. I think we've heard there's context from Jyoti before as well, and I think you mentioned as well these bilateral trade agreements, a gradual shift. I mean, what does all this imply for the ability to actually mobilize that investment in the hydropower, but in the export or trade?
Regarding the investment challenge, it's very critical for us, especially for transmission lines. In Nepal, still now, we do not have any decisions or any system developed. Any system has not been developed yet for wheeling charge, to take the charge of the transmission line to transmit the electricity. And all the transmission lines at present moment, it is operated by Nepal Electricity Authority, which is a semi-government organization. And nowadays we are trying to impose or trying to introduce a system, wheeling charge system, to transmit the power from one place to the another, and take some charges from the independent power producers, from which they transfer the power. And it will provide some investment, for capital investment, for future extension of the grid. That's the one thing. And another part is that for the investment of the grid construction at the present moment, especially for cross-border transmission line, we will have some sort of government investment. 50% of the government, Nepal government, and 50% of Indian government, and they will provide as a equity, and then we will make a company from cross-border power cross-border transmission line company, and based on that company, they will construct and then operate, taking the wheeling charges and other things. And at this moment, what we want to highlight that the investment, the power that will be generated from Nepal, it is most of the 100% of the power is from the green, that is means the hydropower, which is renewable and environment clean. So we want to have some mechanism to carbon credit mechanism, so that we can get the more investment from carbon credit if we account it in for not only for our nation, but also for the exporting countries, where we contribute our electricity and they will reduce the carbon emissions for there. And so we want to have some carbon credit mechanism for export energies as well in our regions.
We're seeing here, I think, a mix between the market instruments on the one side and sort of the mobilization of private investment and reliance on carbon credits as a mechanism that will need policy support. And Sergio, how, in your thinking about green grids and how it's presented, how How does this feature?
Well, we think it's crucial to have political traction. We feel that it's ultimately a political decision, and that's why we have been promoting this initiative, which is, we started with it from this idea that the grids were a key facilitator, even though the largest investment that is needed is in generation. The grids are a smaller amount of investment, but they are very, very strategic. Right now, as it stands, this is a partnership of governments around the world, led by India and by the UK in a secretariat where the Climate Parliament is part of the UK team of the secretariat, with a ministerial steering group that at this point includes the UK, the US, India, France, and other countries or other regions that will be incorporated into it. And in parallel to that, the Green Grids initiative, part of it, which is not directly, I mean, the government's is the Green Grids initiative plus the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative of India. But at the same time, we're building another network of partners that includes energy regulators, that includes system operators, legislators through the Climate Parliament, Wilton Park, an agency, an independent agency of the UK that convenes high-level international dialogues, and other partners. In our launch yesterday, we also included youth leaders, part of that movement, precisely to communicate that sense of urgency and that sense that we're doing it ultimately to prevent a climate catastrophe.
Simon, do we have more questions from the audience?
A couple here, maybe that would be interesting to ask. One is again to Ranjit, and I guess he can interpret this in however he likes. I mean, the question is what level of variation in precipitation was observed across the Southern Africa power pool, and I'm not quite sure what the question is getting at, as to whether that's a sort of in terms of predictions over time as to how that precipitation will vary, or the benefits of being able to tap different levels of precipitation in different parts of the power pool. But please answer that in whichever way you choose.
And Ranjit, if I can abuse my chair position here slightly, I think one of the things that I found striking reading it recently again is just how much investment into hydropower in this sub-Saharan African region is bunched into just a couple of basins that are, according to the IPCC, particularly prone to climate change. And so how do we deal with that? Perhaps that's part of the question of precipitation.
This is a really interesting question. In fact, our climate simulations were done at the University of Cape Town by Piotr Wolski. Well, the way we did it is we looked at like 20 years worth of data, and then looked at the interannual variation as well as the intra-annual variation in precipitation patterns all the way until 2045. And we saw significant variation between years, so interannual, but also the spatial variation. So for example, the DRC was not drying as much as we expected, but then Zambia and like that area saw like more drying. But if you know, or if you've worked with climate models, different models throw out like different results, and then we look at sort of the probability of a particular result in the future. And what we did was we then selectively chose sort of the extreme, or the climate models that gave us the extreme results at each of the different hydropower sort of fleets, and then modeled our electricity systems models, because from our perspective, we want a system that is resilient to whatever changes we might see in the future. And what we are seeing is there is impact on hydropower, but because wind and solar are so much cheaper, across all scenarios, we are not seeing more than, between like less than half of the planned hydropower projects are being built. So the share of hydropower within that entire electricity mix is relatively limited. So whatever climate change impacts we're seeing on the hydropower fleets doesn't have as much impact on the overall sort of electricity generation mix, if that makes sense. And with that, I think, Ben, I might have answered your question as well on how we're dealing with hydropower. There is a lot in the pipeline, but what we are seeing is we may not need as much hydropower, especially with the transmission interconnections and well-developed electricity markets. It's not just the lines that we want to build, but we want good, well-functioning electricity markets. The better trade we have, the less hydropower we would need, especially because a lot of times we just cannot capture the externalities of large hydropower projects, right? We have environmental impacts, we have social impacts, especially those with larger reservoirs. And that's what we are seeing in our results.
Right. Is there another question?
Yeah, there's another couple. I mean, another one sort of building on that, really. We were just talking here about the sort of constraints of hydropower in the Southern African power pool. This question is probably more looking at it in the context of South Asia. But has there been much study on the sort of future of how hydropower, in the context of climate change, and particularly in the context of the melting of glaciers in the Himalayas and likewise? So what's the sustainability of hydropower, I guess, in the South Asian context here?
Maybe Kabuja, if you start off with that one.
Yeah. Okay. The climate change, impacts of the climate change in the Himalayan regions, we can see in two aspects. One is that the glaciers, they are melting very quickly. And the glaciers, they are taken as a water tower, and which provide considerable flow during the low flow seasons, means generally December to April. But the depletion of that glacier, which is rapidly going down, and due to that, we are very cautious that we are very we are very much cautious that if the climate change pertains like that, going on like that, then after 30 years, there may not be a snow and glaciers in the Himalayan region. And it will severely affect the small hydropower projects during the low flow season, that there will be no water for the hydropower productions, not only for the hydropower production, but for irrigations and other water supplies, which will severely affect the livelihoods of the Nepalese people in the mountain areas. That's one part. Next part is due to climate change, the temperature is going on increasing, and the glacier lakes are expanding the glacier lakes and increasing the number of glacier lakes. And these glacier lakes expansion and increasing, it posing a threat to have a glacier lake outburst flood. Recently in 2016, we got one glacier lake outburst flood from Chinese territory, and that damages our hydropower projects, that Potekoshi hydropower projects, which is still not inoperated. It is going on maintenance. Still 2-3 years it has been taken. And now, in addition to that, we have another Gulf events in our territories as well, and it damages a lot of infrastructures, hydropowers, as well as roads and other infrastructures, bridges built in the downstream of that rivers. So these are the much more challenging nowadays for us, that it is caused due to the climate change. We are very much sincere about that. Now, to protect the damages, to minimize the damaging impact, now what we are doing, we are developing the early warning system and early preparedness action plan. And nowadays, nowadays the independent power producers or hydropower producers, they have to put the hydrometeorological stations in their headwork sites, and also in the upper regions of the catchment area, so that they can observe the data with the telemetry system and they can observe the data in the remote areas, upper set, watershed, and then if there is some flood and other events are occurring, then accordingly they will convey the message to the downstream hydropower projects and downstream residents peoples, and so that they can at least they can operate the gates properly early in the time, and then the flood, the damaging effect of the flood that may cause due to glove or flash floods will reduced as far as possible. Such a early warning system has been installed in most of the river basin projects, and we are going to have much more early warning systems for flood and gloves, and these are decided in water resource policy that we have produced just in the last year, that 2021 we have formulated the water resource integrated water resource policies. In that we have included such climate change and how to cope the climate change, disaster risk reductions, and other these activities has been formulated, and plans and programs is going on in that direction.
Abhi, in your thinking about India and that potential interconnector with Gulf states, how have you factored in climate change and the way this might alter both the demand profile and also the output potential in actually both sides of the Gulf?
Yeah, I have to say that would go in the future work section. So at this point, what we've done is for the renewable profiles, we've taken historical data. So we've taken 15 years worth of profiles for hydropower plants, wind and solar, site-specific profiles, but we haven't really looked at the impact of climate change on the supply side. And also, I mean, one area that would be very interesting to look at is with the kind of growing use of air conditioning and other electrical appliances on the demand side, you might see a completely different shape of the load on the Indian side. So that would be interesting to study as well, because the case that we're making right now is given this evening peak in India, which coincides with the solar peak on the GCC side. But if that load shape changes, then that would have implications on the link as well.
Simon, was there something?
Maybe one more, which again is around hydro, and I guess it's talking about the shift that's potentially been talked about here this evening, that hydro is moving more to a sort of peaking, balancing and storage option as opposed to sort of a baseload option, and whether that should affect pricing. Shouldn't therefore a premium be put on hydro because it's there as the sort of short-term balancing agent as opposed to a baseload? So it needs to be able to switch on and switch off really quickly.
Who would like to have a go at that one? Ranjit, I'm going to pick on you.
Sure. I think there should be a premium on hydro. And we have seen in our work in India, like the way hydro is sort of priced is there's a fixed cost and a variable cost, but it's most of it has long-term bilateral contracts, where the price does not change throughout the day. But there are certain project developers, hydro project developers, who are now selling their power on the electricity markets, and they're getting a lot of profits based on that value. And I think having those kind of contracts where you can provide a high price for hydro, especially during the peaking times when demand is high and other renewable energy sources are low, is absolutely important for hydropower, whatever hydropower we have already on the system.
What does this imply then for the procurement of renewables?
For the procurement of renewables or just balancing of renewables? Because procurement of renewables varies across countries. A lot of times they have, most of the times they have these days fixed price contracts or feed-in tariffs. But when you are generating that, and if hydropower does not have the incentive to generate just during those peak hours, you might be operating hydro as a base load, and then you might be relying on other generation sources, especially in those peaking hours, which may not be the most cost effective. use of those resources. So it's more about like how do you balance these wind and solar resources. The better pricing mechanisms we have for hydropower will help us cost effectively integrate wind and solar generation.
Because turning to you, does this not have implications for auction design and perhaps renewable procurement mechanisms more broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think most of the auctions that we've seen in our region have been relatively simple. I think in terms of their objectives, right? It's been to get the lowest price for a generation source such as solar and wind, and that project sells all its energy when it generates over the 20-year period, for example, and gets paid whenever it generates. But as the share of renewables increase in the market, we are going to be needing much more services, much more flexibility, as Ranjit was saying, ancillary services, for example, specifically voltage regulation, capacity. None of this is currently being procured at sufficient scale, and our markets are just not sophisticated enough to deal with them and actually send the right investment signals. And so the next kind of wave of innovation and reform in the sector, and specifically when it comes to procurement in this part of the region that I am in, is going to be around how do we incentivize these kinds of investments through procurement programs. And on top of that, we also then need to start thinking about how do we integrate issues such as the just energy transition, which is a massive issue in the South African region, into how we design our procurement programs. And so there's a whole layer of complexity that needs to be added to procurement design going forward.
Sergio, if we if we pick up on that theme of procurement, I think perhaps it would be great to understand a bit more, for you to explain a bit more about this Green Grids initiative in that regard, because I think at the high level the story is compelling. We promote this trade in renewables. The complexities that I think both Ranjit and Vikas mentioned here, and how you now mobilize that investment, are quite severe, laying on top of it the urgency that you've been alluding to. So how nuanced does something like a Green Grids initiative actually have to be in really gaining traction beyond the headline statement, the slogan, the marketing speech, so to speak?
Yeah, the headlines have to do with the launch, but now the real work begins. We see that this high-level political will is crucial. We see an issue like just transition is very important. Part of that justice has to do with the fact that the most vulnerable communities in the world are like canaries in a coal mine when it comes to the climate crisis. There are studies, for instance, on the impact of climate change on human health and temperature on human health, and the fact that for each additional degree, and we might be talking 2 or 3 more degrees this century, 1 billion people, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, mostly in South Asia, will find themselves in areas that are too hot for human habitation or for crops or livestock to survive. So there's that element of justice that is very crucial. And again, we see political will as fundamental, and we see this commitment at the highest level as very important. But you're absolutely right that then the devil is in the details. Specifically with this initiative, for instance, regarding finance, a working group has been established to precisely, led by the Green Climate Fund and with important support by the Climate Compatible Growth Program, precisely to determine how you can certify that a grid is green. In other words, a grid is potentially technologically neutral, and in terms of funding being funneled toward green investment, that issue of certification is quite crucial, and that working group is working on that. At the same time, there are working groups at the regional level, one for Africa, one for South Asia, And we envision working groups on specific transmission interconnections. So there has to be granularity. I totally agree with your question that at this point, this is high level, it sounds great, but the point of the urgency, I think there's a change in the zeitgeist that still hasn't occurred. And in a way, this infrastructure would make it possible to transition at the speed and scale required to avoid a climate catastrophe. But I would say that political will is still not there. In a way, you could agree with what the youth movement is saying about the leaders, where you're not really, as Greta Thunberg says, you're not taking the crisis as a crisis. You're not in crisis mentality yet. But I believe that the youth movement will have a key role to play in moving that zeitgeist, and suddenly it will seem obvious that we have to transition very, very fast and at a very ambitious scale. But I agree that that doesn't resolve all the details, which are complex, no doubt about it.
Do we have any?
We have. Yeah, the questions continue to come in.
Good. Keep going.
Maybe this is for Wikus, at least initially. Can cross-country energy trade help de-risk large-scale offshore wind across emerging markets? I mean,
yeah, I see no reason why I can't. Right? It's a resource like onshore wind, like solar PV, and I think they are really excellent offshore wind resources in my part of the world. I think what is still a massive risk, at least in South Africa, and I think in many of our neighboring countries as well, when it comes to offshore wind, is the actual infrastructure that is required. So our shorelines are generally quite deep. We generally have the land available to actually have onshore wind at very cost competitive prices, and then the kind of transmission infrastructure that's been so topical in the session is also quite extensive in that type of scenarios. But I mean, we have seen solar projects being bid and procured and soon to reach financial close that have a regional kind of back-to-back power purchase agreements that would allow regional trade to happen, and effectively that reduces the risks for investors. And so there's no reason why that is not possible for offshore wind as well.
This applied to Nepal as well, the possibility of de-risking through regional trade and that being a mechanism for unlocking investment.
Sorry?
So if we're hearing here that the prospect of trade helps de-risk some of these investments, is that something that investors, developers are looking for in Nepal, or is the investment case already strong enough that this is not a priority today?
In Nepal now, the independent power producers, means the private power producers, they are much more interested in developing the hydropower projects. But they are not much more interested to invest in the power transmissions, grid line connections, like that. At this moment, the power transmission grids, they are all built by the government investment. So it's very difficult to attract the investment from private parties, private producers. It's very difficult, and overall the government has built power transmission at this moment.
And is that a problem?
That's a problem actually. That's why we asked the development partners like World Bank, ADB. We have a lot of projects in collaboration with the ADB and World Bank, and they put the soft loan to Nepal government to build transmission lines.
Could I ask my own question here, just building on that, and I think maybe to Abhishek and Sergio, but I think this, we've been talking about the investment that's needed in order to look at the sort of global green grids and these interconnectors. But if you look at the balance, to achieve sort of global green grids, how much of the investment is actually going to be eaten up in the connectors and how much in actually strengthening internal country grids to be able to cope and function as sort of viable markets that can wheel power through and can be effective as in that interconnection. Abhishek, you probably looked at that a little bit, didn't you, in the India research, India Gulf?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, there's another paper that we're doing which looks at that a bit more, the investment needs on the grids, but I don't know if it separates it between cross-border interconnectors and transmission and distribution within the countries. But I think the number that is being talked about is about 800 billion by 2026 to 2030. But that's transmission and distribution as a whole. I'm not sure what fraction of that. I mean, I would just say more modeling is needed to kind of know how much of that needs to go into countries and how much cross-border, maybe such as.
Yeah, I will defer the technical part to Abhishek, but I'm from Chile, and in Latin America, there's been the experience of studies connecting grids kind of point to point at the border, and the experience shows that that doesn't work. And particularly in Central America, there's been technical problems that have to do with just creating a corridor that is just an interconnection of national grids as they are. So obviously, there is a need to think of grid architecture at a continental scale, for sure.
Okay.
Actually, we've seen some of that, I think, in natural gas markets and actually in other electricity markets in Europe and elsewhere, and we cast it even further back, the history of the oil and coal trade. In fact, it started with those point-to-point trades, the connection, the bilateral agreements. And then I think an interesting question sort of happens. It's whether, what then precipitates that change? Is it the commercial realization that by selling differently, by entering different kind of agreements, you can make money, and that encourages the investment, and suddenly that market opens up? Or is it the political change, the deregulation? I think in Europe, in the power markets, that deregulation story is tremendously important. I think in the history of the oil and gas markets, it's the market incentive that's been primarily the driver there that then allowed some contractual changes. So I think it's interesting that you mentioned this here for Latin America. I wonder what you see as the lever that causes that change.
Well, when it comes to Latin America, that is a mystery. Latin America is quite, I would say, lagging behind compared to Europe or even to Africa. I mean, in Africa, there is significant advance on Africa's single electricity market and on integrating or thinking of integrating the different power pools. I would say the southern power pool seems to be the most advanced in this area. In Latin America, it's still a tough nut to crack. There are interconnections in the La Plata region, so Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil, which are obviously around the hydro resources in that area, rather than renewables. Renewables also, I guess in Eurasia, there is a natural, I guess there might be a difference between a continent that is organized along a horizontal axis. Secretary of the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy of India was telling us a couple of years ago that about this idea that is quite predominant now also in the United States of thinking about the grids as storage. So when you're moving the electrons around, it's almost as if you were storing them. And this secretary was saying, for every 10 degrees of longitude that you have interconnections, you're saving 1 hour of storage. So obviously you're extending the solar day, as they call it. In Latin America, would be more of a north to south integration, and that would be more seasonal variations, and you would have to have other elements there. But the short answer is that it's hard to understand. I mean, it's hard to to see in the specific case of Latin America what would be steps toward advancing this quickly or quickly enough. There is a project called in the Summit of the Americas that decided some 9 years ago now to integrate the whole of the Americas for renewables, but progress has been, again, at a time, at a a speed that is very slow and not enough scale.
How about South Asia?
In South Asia also, its story are similar to that. Already in Nepal, we have agreed, we have made a one Muzaffar Talkebar, that 400 kV transmission line. It took about 5 years to complete the transmission line constructions, making joint companies between Nepal and India. And for the decisions, it takes about 500 years, almost 10 years it took, very difficult. Now again, we are considering another new cross-border transmission, that from Butwal to Gorakhpur. It is again 400 kV. And already we have some agreement, bilateral MOU with the government of India. But the materialization of that joint companies, it's still pending. It's not occurring. And it may take much more, again 5-6 years again. For even if they agree on the construction and for forming a joint venture company, then it will take at least 4-5 years for the completion of another cross-border transmission line. So because of that, the investment, lack of investment, the private parties, they are not much more interested to invest in grid connections. That's the major challenge for us.
I think we have time for one more round of questions from the audience. If there are.
Okay, I've got two. I think
that's fine.
One we could sort of pose to Sergio, and then maybe the other to Abhishek, at least initially. So, I mean, Sergio, I think there's a sort of general question about the Green Grid Initiative and where it should focus, and whether the emphasis, should be primarily on cross-border trade and facilitating that, or whether it should be more focused on sort of sorting out national grids and bankrupt utilities and all of that, or whether it should be sort of seeking to maximize the number of people that actually have access to electricity in the first place through densification of grids and creation of mini grids. So in this initiative, how should those sort of different approaches or demands be?
Well, the international interconnections and the regional grids and interregional grids are a big priority of the One Sun, One World, One Grid component, which is this vision by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, very much again thinking of this east to west connections, beginning with, in the case of India, they're very interested in connecting with the Gulf and with Southeast Asia initially, and then in a second phase with Africa, connecting again this India, South Asia, and the Gulf with the African power pools, and then in a third stage, a world grid. On the other side, for us, we think that all grids are important for this very, very fast transition. It's not only the large grids. As a matter of fact, if you think in terms of energy security, renewable energy resources are more evenly distributed around the world than fossil fuels. So if you add that with the fact that you can have multiple interconnections, let's say international interconnection, that gives you that security. But mini grids, microgrids are fundamental for energy access and as an economic enabler. So that is very much part of the Green Grids Initiative partnership, and not only for lifting millions of people out of economic poverty, but also we're seeing, and this is an interesting phenomenon, I was saying that vulnerable communities are like canaries in a coal mine, and maybe it's a fossil fuel metaphor in a way. But we're seeing climate impacts in developed countries, floods in Germany, freezing conditions in Texas during the winter that paralyzed the grid, also grid failures during fires in California. And so particularly, this is interesting, in the United States, a lot of legislators are beginning to promote mini-grids as an instrument of resilience, not only of access. So community grids, small grids, distributed, are becoming an important factor of adaptation to climate change, not only mitigation. So the short response is that we see microgrids, but also smart grids at the urban and national level that can integrate electric vehicles, because it's not only the electric grids that need to be transformed for the climate, but the whole energy sector in reality, transport and others. But of course, the large continental scale grids allow each country and each region should be always, this should go from small to big, in the sense that the large majority of the generation should be and always will be local, but you will need the big grids to compensate fluctuations and to be able to rely on not only day and night, but also basically you need to be able to bring in electrons that are outside of your weather system. So you're not depending on just whether the wind is blowing at a certain time or the sun is shining.
Right, thank you.
So all grids are part of the Green Grids Initiative that way.
Well, that's really been a great overview of quite a large number of questions. I think what's clear from this discussion, drawing it to some conclusion here, if there is such thing, I think that the important message of green grids matter, and grids at all levels matter, as Sergio just said. But I think also what we've heard is that we do need to provide the incentives. The procurement of renewables, the mechanisms through which this is generalized. Investment happens not just at grid, at the power station level, but also at the infrastructure level is so fundamentally important. And there is a capacity building side to it, not just in that physical sense, but also the human side of it, where clearly there are real needs to build this, and each country, each place will be different. I think it's that challenge then that speaks to the fact that the opportunity here is so huge. But we do need to look at the multiple criteria, whether that's in a technical sense, like some of the experts on this panel have done, of looking at how the nexus issues work, but also how the political, the social dimensions interact is so important. And let's not forget the urgency of this all. I think that's a great aspiration here we have still for COP. We're at the beginning of it, so let's stay optimistic. And I do hope we get to see real progress on this topic. Thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you to all of you, the audience online here in the room. I very much appreciate the discussion we had.